The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 9. Commander-in-Chief. The deeds done ere this by the King's troops had made a great stir throughout the land. The chief men of each state met in Philadelphia, and sought out ways and means to help those who were in arms, as foes of King George, and a large force of men from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia were soon on hand to march and join the troops near Boston. But who was to lead them? The choice at once fell on George Washington, but he held back. He thought that Massachusetts troops might not care to be led by a man from the South, and General Ward, who was then at their head, had the first right, for Washington's rank was not so high as his. There was much talk on this score, and in the midst of it a Massachusetts man, John Adams, rose and said that the man he thought fit to lead our troops was in that room, and he came from Virginia. All knew who he meant, and as Washington heard his own name he rose from his seat and left the room. Then votes were cast, and all were for Washington, and he felt that he could not say no to such a call. He spoke his thanks in a few words, and said that he would do the best that he could, and serve without pay. He set out from Philadelphia, June 21st, 1775. With him were General Lee and General Schuyler, and a troop of light horse, which went all the way to New York. As soon as it was known that Washington was on the road, crowds ran out to meet him and to show their pride in him. When he reached New York, he heard of the fight at Bunker Hill, and made haste to join the troops in their camp at Cambridge. He reached there July 2nd. The next day all the troops were drawn out in line, and Washington rode out at the head of his staff till he came to a large elm tree. Here he wheeled his horse, and drew his sword, and took charge of all our troops as their commander-in-chief. He found much to do, and much to bear from his own men as well as from the redcoats. It came to his ears that our men who fell into the hands of the redcoats at Bunker's Hill were not well used, and he wrote at once to Gage and asked him to be less harsh. Gage, who had fought by his side in 1753, when both were young men, wrote back that he thought he should have praise and not blame, since he had saved the lives of those who were doomed to be hung. Washington at first thought he would do as he was done by, but his heart failed him, and those of the redcoats that were in the hands of our troops were set free. If they gave their word they would not fight for King George. By such acts Washington sought to show that Americans are as merciful as they are brave. The camps in which Washington found his troops were as odd as the men themselves. Some of the tents were made of boards, some of sailcloth, or bits of both, while here and there were those made of stone and turf, brick and brushwood. Some were thrown up in haste and bore no marks of care, while a few were wrought with wreaths and twigs, and spoke well for the taste of those who made them. The best camp of all was that of the Rhode Island men, in charge of General Nathaniel Greene. Here were found as good tents as the redcoats had, and the men were well drilled and well dressed. Greene was brought up on a farm. His father was a blacksmith, and at times his son worked with the plow, or took his place at the forge. At the first note of war, Greene left the farm, and in the month of May, 1775, was in charge of all the troops of his own small state. He went to Boston and took notes while there of all that the redcoats did, and in this way he learned much that he could put to good use. His troops had fought at Bunker Hill, and there were none in the whole force that bore themselves so well or made so fine a show. Greene was 6 feet tall, and not quite 20 years of age. He was strong and well built, and his frank way won the heart of Washington, and the two were warm friends from that time. Washington now set to work to add strength to the weak parts of his line, and to throw up fresh works round the main forts. All the livestock had to be kept off the coast so they would not fall into the hands of the foe. He sought to draw the redcoats out of Boston, but they would not stir. When Washington took charge of his troops, he thought he could go back to his home when the cold days came on and spend some time there with his wife. But there was no chance for him to leave. So he wrote to Mrs. Washington to join him in the camp. She came and stayed with him till the next spring, and this was her course all through the war. She came in her own coach and four, with her son and his wife. The black footmen were dressed in red and white, and the whole turnout was in the style in use in Virginia at that day. Washington had his rooms in the Craig House in Cambridge, and here Mrs. Washington took charge and gave the place more of a home like air. At that time the camp of Cambridge was filled with all sorts of troops. Some had spent most of their lives in boats, some were brought up on farms, some came from the woods, and each group wore the dress that pleased them best, and laughed at those who were not dressed the same. This made sport for some time, and jokes flew thick and fast. One day some men came into camp dressed in an odd garb, such as was worn to hunt in. The suit was made of deer skin, and the long shirt had a deep fringe all round. This dress was the cause of much mirth to men who came from the sea shore, and were used to short coats and rough plain clothes. There was snow on the ground, and when the jokes gave out, snowballs took their place, for a war of words is quite sure to end in blows. Men came up to the aid of both sides, fists were used, and all took part in the hand to hand fight, and there was a great stir in the camp. While the fight was at its height, Washington rode up. None of his aides were with him. He threw the reins of his own horse into the hands of the black men who rode near, sprang from his seat, and rushed into the thick of the fray. Then he seized two of the tall stout huntsmen by the throat, and talked to them and shook them while he held them at arm's length. This put an end to the brawl at once, and the rest of the crowd slunk off in haste, and left but three men on the ground, Washington and the two he held in his grasp. As the cold days and nights came on the men grew homesick, and longed to be by their own firesides. It was right that some of them should go, for they had served out their time, and this made the rest lonesome and sad. Songs would not cheer them, and they paid no heed to the words of those who sought to rouse them from the depths of woe. Washington was full of fears, which were shared by all those who were near him in rank. Yet he did not lose hope. General Greene wrote, "They seem to be so sick of this way of life, and so homesick, that I fear a large part of our troops will soon go home." Still his heart did not lose hope. All would come right in time, and his words of cheer were a great help to Washington at this time. The year 1775 had been a dark one for our land, and there was no ray of hope to light the dawn of 1776. There were but 10,000 troops to take the field. There was a lack of arms, a lack of clothes, and a lack of food, and these things made camp life hard to bear, and were a great grief to the heart of the chief. He could not sleep. Had the foe known of their plight, they would have borne down on them and swept them out of sight. But God took care of them. In the first month of the year there was a stir on the Boston wharves. A large fleet of boats lay in the stream, on board of which the redcoats swarmed, and there were two sloops of war filled with guns and warlike stores. All were in charge of General Howe, and Washington guessed what his plans were, and felt that the time had come for him to strive to wrest Boston from the King's troops. The outlook was bright. More troops had come to his aid, and he made up his mind to place part of his force on Dorchester Heights, and if he could, draw out the foe to fight at that place. At a sign, the troops on the heights and at Nook's Hill were to fire at the same time, and rake the town with balls and bomb shells. At the same time boats full of troops were to start from the mouth of the Charles River, and act in the rear of the redcoats. It was thought that these moves on the part of our troops would bring on such a fight as they had on Breed's Hill. On the night of March 4th, our men made their way to the heights, and at dawn of the next day strong forts loomed up, and seemed as if they must have been brought there at the touch of a wand. Howe gazed on them and said, "The rebels have done more work in one night than my whole army would have done in a month." He must drive them from the heights or leave Boston. While pride urged him on, fear held him back, for he knew that his loss would be great. But he must make a move of some sort. So he made up his mind to send boats out that night with a force of troops in charge of Lord Percy. But a storm came up from the east. The surf beat high on the shore where the boats were to have land, and the scheme was put off till the next day. But it stormed just as hard the next day. The rain came down in sheets, and the boats stayed where they were. In the meantime our men kept at work on the hills on the north side and south side, and when the storm ceased, General Howe saw that the forts were now so strong there would be no chance to take them. Nor was it safe for him to stay in Boston. Yet the admiral said that if Howe's troops did not seize the heights, the ships of war should not stay near Boston. So his lordship would have to leave with what grace he could, such as it might wound his pride. When word went forth that the troops were to leave, strange sights were seen in Boston town and bay. For some days the redcoats went this way and that in great haste. More than 70 boats were cast loose for sea, with at least 12,000 men on board of them. While this stir took place not a shot was sent from the heights, and it was well that this was so, as the redcoats had laid plans to set the town in a blaze if our troops fired one gun. The redcoats left Boston March 17th, and our troops in charge of Old Put, as the brave Putnam was called, marched into town in fine style. For some days the fleet lay off the coast of Rhode Island, and it was feared for a while that they meant to strike a blow and win back what they had lost. But no such thing took place, and ere long the fleet sailed out of sight. "Where they are bound," wrote Washington, "and where they next will pitch their tents, I know not." He thought they were on their way to New York, but such was not the case. They had steered for Halifax to wait there for more troops, and for the large fleet that was to come from England. A vote of thanks and a large gold coin with his face on one side of it were sent to Washington by the chief men of the land, as part of his due for what he had so far done to save America from King George's rule. Washington, who thought the next move of the redcoats would be on New York, set out for that place, and reached there April 13th. He went to work at once to build forts and to send out troops, and to make the place as strong as it ought to be. He did not know the plans of the foe, nor from what point they would hurl the bolts of war. All was guesswork, but still in the midst of doubt it would not do to be slack. The town was put in charge of the troops, and the rules were quite strict. Those who went in or out had to give the password. "We all live here, shut up like nuns," wrote one who was fond of a gay life. "There's no one in town that we can go to see, and none to come see us." Good times in New York were at an end. Our troops had been forced to leave Canada, and it was known that the redcoats would push their way to New York. Forts were built on high banks up the Hudson, and on the isles at its mouth, and all done that could be done to check them in their march. In the meantime it had been thought a good plan to set a day in which it might be shown throughout the land that America was, and of a right ought to be, a free land. So in July an act was drawn up and signed by the wise men who met in Philadelphia to frame the laws for the new states. And there was great joy, for it was a great day. Bells were rung, shouts and cheers rent the air, fires blazed and hearts burned, and men knelt to pray and give thanks to God. John Adams said the 4th of July ought to be kept up with great pomp throughout America, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells and bonfires till the end of time. The news did not reach New York till July 9th, and at 6 o'clock that night Washington read the act to his troops. New York was wild with joy, and felt that more must be done than just to ring bells and light fires. In Bowling Green, in front of the fort, there stood a cast of George III, made of lead. This a mob of men pulled down and broke up, that the lead might be run into small shot and be used in the cause for which they fought. This did not please Washington, and he told his troops they must not take part in such deeds. The joy did not last long, for on July 12th the ships of war in the bay sent out a broadside, and it was thought they would at once fire the town. Crowds were on the streets. The troops flocked to their posts. Fear was in each heart, and New York was in a great stir. But two ships, the Phoenix and the Rose, left the fleet and shaped their course up the Hudson. Then the guns were still, and fear died out for a while. That night there was a fresh scare. Guns boomed, and clouds of smoke were seen near the ships of war down the bay. Men on the lookout told that a ship of the line had come in from sea, and each man of war gave her a round of guns as she passed by. At her foretop masthead she bore the flag of St. George. No need to tell more. "Lord Howe is come! Lord Howe is come!" was the cry that went from mouth to mouth, and the word soon flew through the town, and all felt that the hour of doom was close at hand. Lord Howe sought peace, and not bloodshed, and hoped, by the terms he would make, to bring not a few hearts back to their king. but he came too late. The King's troops did not think much of the rank that was borne by our men, who, they felt, had no right to put on the airs they did, and call themselves grand names. In a few days Lord Howe sent one of his men on shore with a flag of truce to seek speech with Wash ing ton. The man's name was Brown. His boat was met half way by a barge which had on board one of our troops named Reed, to whom Brown said he had a note for Mr. Wash ing ton. Reed said he knew no man of that name. Brown held out to him the note he had in his hand, which bore on its face George Wash ing ton, Esq. Reed said that he could not take the note. He knew what was due to his chief, so there was naught for Brown to do but to take to his oars. He had not gone far when he came back to ask what style shall be used to please Here he caught himself and said, "Mr. Wash ing ton." Reed told him that Wash ing ton's rank was well known, and Lord Howe could be at no loss as to the right style. In a day or two the aide de camp came with a flag from Lord Howe, and asked if Col. Pat ter son might have speech with Gen er al Wash ing ton. Reed, who met the aide, was prompt to grant this, and pledged himself that no harm should come to him who came in the King's name. So the next day Pat ter son came, and when he stood face to face with Wash ing ton, bowed and said, "Your Ex cel len cy." Wash ing ton met him with such form and state. He was not a vain man, but was proud of the rank he held, and thought that no man, were he a king, had a right to look down on A mer i ca, or show the least slight to her Com mand er in chief. When he came to hear the terms on which Lord Howe sought to make peace, he found they were not such as he could take. So the war went on. End of chapter 9.